Hello everyone, it's George from Ireland. So it's just over a century since the Kilmichael Ambush took place. It was the 28th of November, 1920, and there's a ballad about it, The Boys of Kilmichael, starting something like this: whilst we honour in song and in story the name of Pearson McBride, and whose heroes whose names are illumined in glory, and those who long since have died. Forget not the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white, and blue. So, uh, well, I'll just give you a synopsis of it. The IRA, Irish Republican Army, was this guerrilla insurgent force, very active in Ireland at the time, particularly in West Cork, the real cockpit of IRA activity. And they're fighting against the Crown Forces, the British Army, and the Royal Irish Constabulary, RIC. So the RIC were mostly Irish, but as the IRA had been killing RIC men and wounding some of them, others retired, others died biologically, and the other people were just not coming forward to replace them. Very few recruits because of fear of assassination and indeed distaste for their counterinsurgent role. What else? So some people intimidated into resigning as well. Um, so therefore, the government, because part of the United Kingdom at the time, felt they had to fill the ranks of the RIC with men from Great Britain. So they formed the RIC Special Constabulary, usually opprobriously known as the Black and Tans, and the Auxiliary Division. And so the Auxiliary Division arrived in Ireland in July 1920, and they were auxiliary insofar as they were helping the RIC. They weren't engaged in ordinary RIC duties, catching pickpockets, searching for lost children. And their role was solely to fight the IRA, and they went around in fairly large units. Police officers usually just go around in ones and twos, but not the auxiliaries. So they were all veterans of the First World War, mostly served in the British Army, the Royal Air Force, which had just been created, or indeed the Royal Navy. So we probably would recognise some of them now as having post-traumatic stress disorder, perhaps verbal tics, scars, and things like that. They couldn't be too badly injured because they're physically disabled. They wouldn't have been able to do the job. And there's the obviously myth going around that they were the scrapings of English prisons. I haven't seen any evidence that a single person was let out of jail to join it, because they were in the police. If you had a criminal record, that automatically ruled you out from joining. You could read Guerrilla Days in Ireland by Tom Barry, who was commander of the IRA's flying column in West Cork, very well-known figure. Grew up in Ross Carbery. There's a plaque on his house, comedy called General Barry. Anyway, he was a veteran of the British Army, of the Royal Artillery. So the auxiliaries, as he said, auxiliaries had a reputation as super fighters. So they were worried about this, striking fear into the IRA. So Barry set out to prove that this wasn't the case. So it was in a regular conflict, and this tends to lower standards of chivalry on both sides, as Field Marshal Montgomery said. Montgomery was serving in Cork at the time. In his subsequent memoirs, he made that observation, because this is outside the Geneva Convention, say outside the IRA, not fighting from a sovereign state, not wearing a uniform, sometimes at a chain of command, very often killing unarmed people whom they accused of being informers. And the Crown Forces killed some unarmed people as well. But anyway, so the auxiliaries had made the mistake of establishing a pattern. 3 Sunday afternoons in a row, they'd driven along a certain route in the same direction each time. So the IRA thought there's a considerable chance this next Sunday they will drive along the same road at roughly the same time in that direction. So Barry and his men, they took up position, this lonely moor called Kilmichael in West Cork, not that far from Macroom. These particular auxiliaries were based at Macroom Castle. So 2 lorry loads came, a total of 18 auxiliaries. Anyway, and Barry said there was no escape, because it was just like open countryside. You'd want a forest or something like that, so that if it all goes wrong, you're being defeated, they could run away and not be too easily seen, not be too easily pursued. And it was towards twilight, so there'll be a bit of darkness to escape in. Never quite sure what sort of time they're going to show up, if at all. And having some sort of scout to signal they were coming here or there. You can read his account of it, and then some donkey cart coming along and having to be told to get out of the way at the last minute. So Barry, according to himself, he had a IRA tunic, which would look like an officer's tunic from the British Army, something like that. I think complete with Sam Brown, this leather webbing to keep your revolver or whatever. And there at the roadside, signaling to stop. So assuming him to be a British Army officer, the Auxies did indeed slow down, and that's when fire was opened. But and he was trying to throw a Mills bomb, like a grenade, into the cab. I don't know if that succeeded. I don't remember actually. I'm recording this from memory, and fire was opened by IRA men in position, hiding in the heather, bracken, and so on, behind rocks. So I won't go through all the particulars of the combat, but the two lorries was a small distance apart. And the long and the short of it is that all 18 auxiliaries were killed, not all of them immediately. And one of them was wounded and crawled away into a bog, but then he maybe fell unconscious, but he came round and he knocked on the door of a local cottage, asking them to give him aid. But these people tipped off the IRA. He promptly came and shot him. If they hadn't done that, they would have been in grave danger from the IRA themselves. So he's buried in the local Church of Ireland graveyard because he was a presumable Protestant. Anyway, the controversy has raged for a century over this particular incident. Now, the actions of the IRA are now endorsed by the mainstream in the Republic of Ireland with regard to this conflict, the 1919 to 21 conflict. They're killing police officers. The Crown obviously said it was murder because the IRA is not an army. And with the Crown forces, they are legitimate. They're lawful because the UK government is the rightful authority in Ireland, something that many people in Ireland contested. Anyhow, so was there a forced surrender trick? Barry maintains in his book that there was. Some of them shouted, "We surrender," and threw away their rifles. And so two of the IRA men stood up to take their surrender, and the auxiliaries then opened fire. Now, the two lorries some distance away was in one lorry. They'd got out onto the road to open fire and said that. I'm not sure why they stopped. I can't remember whether there was something blocking their path or a mine went off. Surely the thing would be to drive out of there. You're in the lorry, relatively safe. I know this is just a canvas side, and there's a bit of a wooden wall, but only quite a low height. So you could duck down and lie down on the floor of the lorry and just speed out of there. That would have been their best option, really. I don't think they trenched the road or put some obstacle there. But once you're out on the road, you're exposed to IRA fire, and the IRA are taking cover as best they can behind trees, bushes, rocks, something hard like a tree to stop a bullet, or just out of sight as much as possible, occasionally popping their head up to fire. But so, according to Barry, there was a false surrender trick, and this ruse de guerre meant that when they subsequently decided to surrender, there was no mercy, and Barry said, "We shan't give them any quarter," and fired till they were all dead. So 3 of his men had been hit by bullets. I can't remember which one of them died instantly, and which 2 were mortally wounded, died sometime later. And one of them was a 16-year-old. I think he wasn't supposed to be there. He was from Bandon, I think, and Liam Deasy was his brother, who wrote Towards Ireland Free, and Barry was incensed by Deasy's memoir, and later wrote about refutations, trying to disparage and debunk what he thought were the falsehoods published in Deasy's account. So it was Liam Deasy's younger brother was the one who was killed. Anyway, so did this false surrender trick take place or not? It's disputed. There was the Crown forces, they captured what they thought was an IRA after-action report. Not certain it was written by Barry, which didn't mention this false surrender trick, and there was supposedly some other document written maybe 20 years later which wasn't mentioned. Whereas Guerrilla Days in Ireland was published in 1948. So, and Barry said he wrote the whole book, showed it to his solicitor. I think his wife typed up, maybe he dictated, typed it from notes. And then the only chapter he written was the Execution of Spies. He says that right at the beginning, because he named people. He thought, well, many of them have relatives still living in Cork, and so I don't want them to cause them grief or ostracism, so I shan't mention their names, just calls them letters A, B, C. But nothing else, I think, nothing else was changed. So a newspaper report said that these men were cadets, and strictly speaking they were, because they're very new in the RIC, training to be police officers, but like on the job. But it might be a bit misleading, because they weren't just 18, they were all at least 20, because they were all veterans of the First World War, some of them well into their 20s, into their 30s. and said that their bodies had been mutilated with axes. I don't know if that's true. I don't think the IRA would carry axes around with them. Okay, there was sheer hatred towards the Ogsies. They were not regarded by the IRA as an honourable enemy, and the feeling was mutual. That's usually the case in an insurgency. Could have been someone else subsequently came along and did that. I don't know. Barry says there were no spectators to the fight. How do you know? There could be somebody a mile off, 2 miles off. If you were watching, you might want to keep your head down because there are bullets flying around, and the IRA might not want you to know who they were. Or if the Crown Forces won, they might assume you're somehow with the IRA, because the IRA had unarmed scouts sometimes going ahead saying, yeah, there's soldiers up ahead, or saying, yeah, they're coming. Anyway, years later, Barry was contacted by someone in the UK government, I think, to say, would he sign some form for life insurance claims to verify that these men had been killed in combat, and he refused to do so because that would have been helpful to people who were erstwhile enemies. Well, it would have been helpful for their widows and orphans, but there we are. It's like General Percival, I think it was, decades later wrote to Barry saying, well, would you be willing to meet? Could we let bygones be bygones and at least be civil to each other? And he said no way, he'd only want to meet him at the point of a gun. You know, Percival commanded the Essex Regiment in Cork, whom Barry accused of torturing IRA suspects. Did the Essex Regiment kill any civilians? I'm not aware that they did, any allegations against them. There were against the RIC Special Reserve. Not sure about against the auxiliaries. Barry's about the most prejudiced source you could possibly have, because it was a partisan of the IRA and chief of staff of the IRA in the late 1930s and so on. And he claims that the RIC Special Reserve, that's they're commonly called the Black and Tans, would drive around and shoot at anyone they saw toiling in the fields, shoot to miss slightly, make him run and start laughing if it was a game, make him run and run and run and shoot him, but occasionally actually hit him and kill him, and thought that didn't matter because they were totally anti-Irish. But he never cited a single example. Where did this happen? Who did this happen to? No corroborating particulars. So I think it is a lie by him, an attempt to calumniate the Crown Forces. So anyway, this was a great success for the IRA. Whether these guys surrendered or not, even if you didn't kill them in combat, if they had surrendered and let them live, that was a success for them. They burned the 2 lorries. Barry says that because his men were quite shaken because they'd been through this combat situation, there was a drill amidst the dead. He made them march up and down to try and restore some sense of order before they hurried away, the faraway camp of Grenure, as the ballad ends it. So that was it. So it was quite a blow to the Crown Forces in West Cork, and so the Crown Forces started to go out in larger numbers, so they couldn't be outnumbered. They were outnumbered by the IRA about 2-1 at Kilmichael. But if you go out in groups of 50, the flying column couldn't muster much more than that at a time, because that's too big a group. They're too noticeable. And there's a question of, like, their commissariat. They're having to ask local people for food who gave it willingly or out of fear. Would not be a good idea to refuse the IRA what they wanted, because they'd killed so many people, some unarmed people, well over 100 people killed unarmed by the IRA at this time, calling them civilians. So the Cork IRA was really vicious. There was sort of spy fever. Not to say there were no informants, probably were. I mean, the Victoria Barracks, now Collins Barracks, confirms that, because local people working in Victoria Barracks, as it was at the time, and had access to some of these files, tipping off the IRA who the informers were, killed in Cork City, taken to Tory Top Lane, and their corpses often dumped there. So, was there a forced surrender trick or not? Just don't know. Sometimes the IRA had defeated the Crown Forces in ambush, got them to surrender, taken their weapons off them, burned their lorry, and then hurried away. But this time, choosing not to. Did they kill people who'd probably surrendered? The Peter Hart wrote a book about it, the IRA and its enemies, Community and Violence in Cork, 1916 to 21. Absolutely scintillating book. This Canadian historian published it in 1998, based on interviews he'd made 10 years earlier. But there's some dispute about that, and Medda Ryan is the main partisan for Tom Barry, blazoning forth his reputation and saying that he was gallant and he fought for a righteous cause and so on. He never did anything that would be against the laws of war. And there was one Irish Army officer who in recent decades has looked into the Kilmichael Ambush and said these Ogsies, they had enough ammunition for just a few minutes fighting. They surrendered and almost all of their ammunition was there. So they'd fired very little, it seems. they had not fought very long at all, just for under a minute. And the IRA didn't take it with them. I mean, probably they didn't have time. And, well, also it was heavy. Although the Crown forces didn't discover these guys till the next day. The report of guns might have been heard some distance away, but also the flames and the lorries they were burning. But the IRA were at least 10 miles from the nearest British Army or RIC post, so enough time to fade into the night. But so it was the biggest slaying of Crown forces in Ireland until the Narrow Water bomb in August 1979, the same day that Lord Mountbatten was assassinated. So quite a coup for the IRA. But it really ratcheted up the conflict in Cork at the time, and there was the Dillon's Cross ambush in Cork on the 11th of December, so just a fortnight later, which led to members of the auxiliaries there burning Patrick Street in Cork, the main commercial street in Cork, and indeed in the whole of Munster. And the Croke Park slayings had been not long before, the Bloody Sunday in Dublin, because what I don't want to talk about that whole incident, the IRA killing lots of people in Dublin, up to 20, who they said were undercover Crown agents, and some of them were openly members of the RIC. These guys were killed in Dublin in November 1920, the supposed undercover agents. Were they undercover agents? Everyone seems to simply assume that they were. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's false. Anyway, so there were commemorations were held at Kilmichael many times, and Barry went back there. You can see videos of him talking about it. But when he's talking about this false surrender trick, he starts rubbing his nose and looking away and blinking a lot, which is a tell of lying. So he's probably lying to us about that. But he has people who think he's absolutely fantastic and would never do anything like this. So some people are very close-minded about him because they approve of his cause. They assume that he's not doing something which is unethical, even supposedly by the IRA standards at the time. They claim they're soldiers and they abide by the Geneva Convention. But if you're not wearing a uniform, you're outside the Geneva Convention, you can be viewed as a spy and then summarily executed. This went on in the Second World War, subsequent conflicts. No one ever complained about that. So whether you approve of Barry's cause or not, it's likely that he did kill people who had surrendered and were legitimate members of a proper armed force, the police. And they might say, well, the Crown forces had no place in Ireland. You might well believe that, but they were a properly constituted police force. Anyway, so that's just a little bit about the Kilmichael ambush. I visited the site. I'll go back again soon, if so long as coronavirus permits. That's all from me. Toodaloo.